What if one freezing night changed everything you believed about miracles? Picture this: a lone cabin buried under a blizzard in the Montana mountains, wind howling like 1,000 ghosts, and a man sitting by the fire trying to forget the world. Then, his German shepherd suddenly leaps into the storm, vanishing into white silence. Minutes later, he returns carrying something small, cold, and almost lifeless in his jaws. What happened out there in the dark will melt your heart and remind you that even in the coldest moments, love still finds its way home. Tell me, where are you watching from today? The town of Farridge, Montana, slept under the weight of a merciless winter. Wind howled down the frozen streets like an ancient spirit searching for warmth, slamming against shuttered windows and setting the pine forest into a ghostly sway. The night sky was a sheet of ash and snow, the kind that erased the world's edges until even the mountains seemed to vanish. In a cabin on the outskirts, the soft crackle of a wood-burning stove was the only sign of life. Inside sat Ethan Ward, a man of 39 with the quiet, contained strength of someone who had lived through both chaos and silence. Once a search and rescue officer, he now spent his days maintaining trails and radio towers for the county, a solitary job that fit his soul's exhaustion. His shoulders were broad but slightly hunched, his dark hair peppered with early gray, and his face marked by faint scars around the jawline, reminders of a collapsed bridge he'd once crawled across to save a stranger. Since the accident that took his partner 3 winters ago, Ethan had withdrawn from most people, preferring the company of snow, pine, and his loyal companion, a 4-year-old German shepherd named Ranger. Ranger was large for his breed, a striking mix of black and tan, with a dense winter coat that shimmered under firelight. His eyes, deep amber and impossibly alert, carried both the discipline of a trained rescue dog and the gentleness of a creature that understood human grief. He had served beside Ethan during their years in the Mountain Search Division, and though the uniform was gone, the bond remained, forged in storms and silence alike. When Ethan worked at his desk that evening, writing reports under the dim glow of an oil lamp, Ranger lay by the fire, his ears twitching every time the wind pressed against the door. The storm outside was growing wild. Snow pelted the windows, and the sound of distant thunder rolled across the ridgeline. Rare in such cold weather, yet somehow fitting for the night's strange electricity. Ethan rubbed his eyes, his pen pausing above the page. He had meant to finish this report hours ago, but fatigue clung to him like frost. Ranger, usually asleep by now, suddenly stiffened. His ears rose, his head tilted, and a low growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan looked up. "What is it, buddy?" he asked, his voice hoarse from the dryness of the cabin air. Ranger rose to his feet, muscles rippling beneath his fur. He turned toward the door and gave a short, sharp bark, not out of fear, but urgency. Ethan frowned, stood, and crossed the room. Outside, the wind screamed. He opened the door slightly and a gust of snow burst in, coating the wooden floor. The flashlight beam caught nothing but white chaos. "Probably just a fox," Ethan murmured, but before he could close the door, Ranger slipped past him, leaping into the storm. "Ranger!" Ethan shouted, stepping onto the porch, but his voice was swallowed instantly by the wind. All he could see were faint paw prints disappearing into the blizzard. He hesitated. The storm was bad, and visibility barely 5 feet. Yet that hesitation lasted only a heartbeat. He grabbed his heavy parka, threw the hood up, and snatched his flashlight from the counter. "You're going to get us both killed, you fool," he muttered with a grim smile, locking the cabin behind him. Outside, the world was madness. Snow driving sideways, air so cold it burned his lungs. The forest that surrounded the cabin was reduced to a maze of white shadows. Ethan pressed on, boots sinking deep, the beam of his flashlight flickering like a dying star. Every few seconds he called Ranger's name, but the only answer was the wind's long, lonely whistle. Then, faintly, a bark. He turned, followed the sound. Another bark, closer now, then a shape moving between the trees. Ranger, half covered in frost, his muzzle clamped around something small. Ethan stumbled forward, heart pounding. The dog dropped his burden gently at his feet, a tiny puppy, no more than 6 weeks old, fur matted and crusted with ice. Its body barely moved. Ethan fell to his knees, his gloved hands trembling as he brushed the snow from its face. "Dear God," he whispered. The pup's nose was pale, its eyelids frozen shut. But when he placed a finger on its chest, he felt the faintest flutter of life. Ranger whined softly and nudged the pup closer with his nose. Ethan's training took over. He pulled off his glove, cradled the little creature against his chest beneath his coat, and rose to his feet. The cold tore at his exposed hand, but he didn't care. "Let's get home," he said, voice low and urgent. Ranger turned immediately, leading the way through the storm like a ghost of strength cutting through the dark. The return felt endless. Snow blinded him, his flashlight dimmed, and his legs grew heavy. Twice he slipped, once nearly falling face first into a drift. Each time, Ranger circled back, barking sharply, as if demanding he not give up. By the time they reached the cabin again, Ethan's lips were blue and his fingers numb. He slammed the door shut behind them, collapsing onto the floor. The sudden quiet of the cabin felt unreal, the storm now just a muffled roar beyond the walls. Ethan moved quickly. He laid the puppy on a folded wool blanket near the fire, stripped off his wet gloves, and began to rub its tiny paws between his palms. Ranger stood over them, tail twitching, eyes fixed on the motionless pup. "Come on, little one," Ethan murmured. He filled a small metal cup with warm water, dipped his fingers, and let the drops fall onto the pup's tongue. Nothing. He tried again, gentler this time. The pup's body twitched faintly. Ethan leaned closer, holding it against his own chest to share body heat. "You're not dying tonight," he whispered. "Not after he brought you this far." Minutes passed. Or maybe hours. The storm. Outside roared on, the fire popped and hissed, and Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Then, a small sound. A whimper, so faint it could have been the wind. The puppy stirred, shivering violently before letting out a weak cry. Ranger's ears shot up. He gave a soft bark, the kind only dogs give when relief overwhelms fear. Ethan smiled, the tightness in his chest breaking. "That's it," he said, voice shaking. "That's it. Fight." He looked at Ranger, whose fur was still dusted with melting snow. "You knew, didn't you? Somehow you just knew." Ranger tilted his head, amber eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment, man and dog sat in silence, the air between them thick with something almost holy, a quiet understanding beyond words. Outside, the storm began to fade, its fury giving way to the steady hush of falling snow. The cabin's windows glowed faintly against the darkness, a small island of warmth in a frozen sea. Ethan placed another log on the fire, the flames rising to a soft golden hue that bathed the three of them, man, dog, and the fragile spark of life they had reclaimed, in gentle light. He leaned back against the wall, exhaustion overtaking him, yet a small smile lingered at the corner of his mouth. "Guess we're not alone out here after all," he murmured. Ranger lay down beside him, one paw resting protectively across the blanket. The puppy, now breathing evenly, curled into the warmth between them. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something stir beneath the weight of his solitude. A quiet hope, fragile as the flicker of firelight. The night pressed on, but within that humble cabin, life had defied the storm. And as snow whispered against the roof, Ethan thought that maybe, just maybe, miracles didn't come from the heavens, but from hearts that refused to stay cold. The storm had not truly passed. It only slept, murmuring beyond the cabin walls like some tired giant. The wind still pressed against the windows, whispering through the cracks, but inside, the fire burned with a steady golden light. Ethan Ward, weary but alert, sat cross-legged beside the hearth, sleeves rolled up, his hands trembling from exhaustion and cold. Across from him lay the small puppy, no larger than a loaf of bread, wrapped in an old woolen blanket that had once belonged to his mother. The pup's fur was white and silver, though now streaked with faint patches of gray from melted ice. Ethan guessed it to be no older than 6 or 7 weeks. A female, judging from her small frame and the delicate curve of her muzzle. Her breathing came shallow, like the slow flutter of a dying candle. Beside her, Ranger rested, eyes fixed on every twitch of her fragile body. The big German shepherd had refused to move since they had returned, his fur still damp, the scent of snow clinging to him. Occasionally, he would press his nose to the pup's flank, as though reminding her that she was not alone. Ethan's face was drawn and pale under the flickering firelight. The years had carved faint hollows under his cheekbones, and the stubble along his jaw made him look older than 39. He had seen too many lives slip away in the cold, victims of avalanches, lost hikers, stranded motorists. But never before had the fight for life felt so intimate, so close to the pulse of his own chest. He rubbed his palms together, generating warmth, and began to massage the puppy's legs. "Come on," he whispered, his voice steady but heavy with fatigue. "You've got a whole life waiting, little one. Don't stop now." Minutes passed, the cabin filled with the scent of burning pine. Ethan poured a few drops of warm water into a spoon, held it near the pup's lips, and waited. Nothing. He exhaled sharply through his nose, jaw tightening. Ranger made a low, uneasy sound, as if urging him to keep going. Ethan dipped a corner of cloth into warm milk. He always kept a few cans of powdered milk for long winters, and touched it to the pup's mouth again. This time, a flicker. The faintest movement of her tongue, a small, instinctive attempt to swallow. Ethan froze, then leaned closer, heart thundering. "That's it," he murmured. "Good girl. Easy now." Slowly, steadily, the pup drank. Each drop seemed to pull her closer from some dark edge between life and death. Ethan could almost feel it, the fragile bridge being rebuilt, one heartbeat at a time. When she finally gave a tiny sigh and nestled deeper into the blanket, Ranger whined softly, laying his chin beside her. Ethan smiled weakly, his breath fogging in the cold air that still leaked through the cabin door. "You brought her back, didn't you, partner?" he said. "Couldn't stand leaving her out there." He leaned back, feeling the strain in his muscles ease slightly. The light danced across the log walls, throwing shifting shadows that made the room seem alive. Ethan's mind drifted, unbidden, to an old memory. His late partner, Sarah McKinney, a woman of quiet courage and a smile that could cut through any storm. She had been his equal in every rescue, taller than most men, with narrow shoulders and quick, capable hands. She used to hum while setting up ropes or tending to the injured, a habit that had driven him half mad until the day she died in an avalanche 3 years ago. Since then, Ethan had stopped humming. He had stopped much of everything, but tonight, with that small, trembling life before him and Ranger's steady presence beside him, something loosened in his chest. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was something close, a stirring, like a thaw deep under ice. Hours crept by. The storm's fury faded to a gentle hush. Ethan built the fire higher, the orange light licking across the stone hearth. Ranger, sensing calm, curled around the pup, his massive frame forming a wall of warmth. Ethan draped another blanket over them both and sat back in his armchair, watching. The exhaustion he had been fighting all night finally began to claim him, but he resisted, unwilling to take his eyes off the fragile miracle beside the fire. At some point near dawn, he dozed. His dreams were soft, full of snowflakes that did not burn but danced, memories of simpler days when the cold did not mean danger. When he woke, the fire had dimmed to embers, and a faint light filtered through the frost-coated window, the first hint of morning. He stirred, stiff and sore, and turned toward the hearth. The sight made his heart lift. The pup, awake, blinking with cloudy blue eyes that caught the faint firelight. She sneezed, an almost comical sound in the silence, then yawned so wide he could see her tiny teeth. Ranger raised his head, gave her a slow lick across the muzzle, and the pup nuzzled back clumsily, tail twitching under the blanket. "Well, I'll be damned," Ethan said softly, his voice thick with awe. "You made it." He reached out and stroked her head, feeling the warmth of life beneath his fingertips. For a moment, everything outside, the cold, the grief, the silence of the mountains, disappeared. All that remained was this small, improbable flame of existence. "You've got spirit, kid," he said. "Guess Ranger here isn't the only fighter in the house." Ranger looked up at him, ears perked as if understanding. Ethan chuckled under his breath. It had been a long time since laughter sounded natural coming from him. He rose, stretched, and poured himself a cup of coffee from the dented kettle. Steam curled through the air, mingling with the scent of pine wood and wet fur. The storm had left a pale light over Ferridge, the kind that made the snow outside shimmer like powdered glass. He stood by the window, staring out at the world, then spoke quietly without turning around. "You know, "Boy," he said to Ranger, "maybe this is how grace works, not all at once, just a spark when you least expect it." The German shepherd padded over, nudging Ethan's leg. Behind him, the little pup, still too weak to stand properly, let out a squeaky bark. It was faint, but bright enough to make Ethan smile again. He crouched, scratching her under the chin. "You're stubborn," he said. "That's good. You'll need it out here." He thought of names, Snowdrop, Willow, Miracle, but none felt right. "We'll find you one," he whispered. "You earned it." Outside, the light strengthened. The snow glittered, the storm clouds retreating toward the horizon. Ethan knelt to feed the pup a few drops of warm milk again, then wrapped her gently in the blanket once more. Ranger watched, tail sweeping the floor, his expression soft but proud. When the pup drifted back into sleep, Ethan sat back against the wall, letting his head rest. He glanced at the small wooden cross that hung near the window, a keepsake from Sarah, carved during a rescue mission years ago. Its edges were worn smooth by time, but its message still echoed in him. Faith survives the cold. He looked at Ranger and the sleeping pup, and for the first time in years, Ethan found himself whispering a quiet prayer, not for rescue, not for forgiveness, but for gratitude. Outside, snow still fell, light as breath, covering the scars of the storm. Inside, 3 hearts beat together in the warmth of a flickering fire. One man rediscovering purpose, one dog proving loyalty once again, and one tiny creature clinging stubbornly to the gift of life. In that fragile stillness, Ethan understood something that no storm could erase. The true miracle wasn't in what was saved, but in what was awakened, the part of him that still believed in mercy. The storm broke with the dawn. By the time the sun reached the ridge above Farridge Valley, its light fell across a world reborn in white. The trees bowed under fresh snow, their branches glittering like glass, and the frozen river gleamed faintly beneath the crusted ice. Ethan Ward stepped outside his cabin, the crunch of his boots breaking the silence. The air was brittle and pure, sharp enough to sting the lungs, but it carried the clean scent of pine and renewal. Inside, the cabin's fire still smoldered. Ranger sat near the hearth, keeping guard over the small, silver-furred puppy that now slept soundly in a nest of wool blankets. She had survived the night, against all odds, and that victory lent Ethan a rare calm he hadn't felt in years. But Ranger was restless. Each time Ethan moved toward the door, the shepherd's head rose, ears pricked, eyes steady on the snow outside. It wasn't the usual curiosity. It was knowing, instinctive, urgent. Ethan noticed. "You want to go back out there, don't you?" he asked softly. Ranger gave a quiet whine, his tail tapping once against the floorboards. "You think there's something more." Ethan sighed, reaching for his thick parka. He was a man who didn't ignore that kind of look. He had learned long ago that when Ranger listened to the world, it usually had something to say. He checked his gear, gloves, flashlight, a thermos of coffee, a length of rope, and his old field radio, half broken but serviceable. "All right," he murmured, "let's see what you found last night." He knelt beside the fire, brushing his hand gently over the puppy's head. "You stay warm, little one," he said, his voice tender. "We'll be back soon." The pup stirred but didn't wake, her tiny paws twitching in dreams. Ranger gave one last glance toward her before pushing through the door, nose lifted to the wind. The cold hit them like a wall. The snow reached up to Ethan's knees in places, and the light that filtered through the trees was thin and silvery. The trail Ranger had carved the previous night was half covered already, but the dog found it without hesitation, his body low, moving with the quiet precision of a creature made for the wild. Ethan followed, boots creaking through the crusted snow. They passed through a grove of aspen trees whose trunks gleamed pale as bone, their black scars like eyes watching silently. The air was utterly still, save for the soft rhythm of Ranger's breathing. Every few yards, the dog paused, sniffing the ground, testing the air, then pressed onward. After nearly an hour, the forest opened into a shallow clearing. Fallen branches lay tangled under the snow, and a pine tree, snapped clean in half, leaned against its neighbor, forming a crooked arch. Ranger stopped beneath it, his fur bristling. Ethan approached, breath fogging the air. "What is it, boy?" he asked, scanning the white ground. Then he saw it. Faint depressions in the snow, smaller than Ranger's paw prints but fresh, too fresh to belong to the pup he'd saved. He knelt, brushing snow aside. Underneath lay a shallow hollow, half hidden beneath the fallen pine. He hesitated, then cleared more away. And there it was. A shape, frozen still, almost blending with the snow. A female German shepherd, her fur matted and stiff with frost. Her body curved protectively around three tiny forms pressed against her chest. Ethan's breath caught. The mother's eyes were closed, her muzzle half buried in ice, but the devotion in her posture was unmistakable. For a moment, time stopped. Ranger moved forward, whining low, then nudged her gently, as if unwilling to believe she was gone. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat tight. He had seen many deaths in his line of work, human and animal alike, but this one felt heavier. There was love here, frozen in its purest form. He brushed more snow away, revealing the puppies. Two were completely still, but the third, just barely, moved. A faint twitch, a shudder of breath that stirred a wisp of frost. Ethan's pulse surged. "Hold on," he whispered, already unzipping his coat. He scooped the pup carefully into his gloved hands. Its body was stiff, cold as stone, but the warmth of his palms coaxed the smallest flicker of life. Ranger circled the hollow, sniffing the ground, then sat beside the fallen tree. His amber eyes lifted to Ethan's, full of something like sorrow and understanding. "You did everything you could," Ethan murmured, looking at the mother dog. "You kept them alive as long as you could." He gently reached down and touched her fur. It was stiff, but the gesture felt like a prayer. "Rest easy now. We'll take it from here." He wrapped the surviving puppy inside his jacket beside his chest. The movement pressed a wave of warmth into his ribs, fragile but steady. Ranger whined again and nudged the mother's muzzle one last time before turning back toward the trail. Ethan lingered a moment, removing one glove to carve a small cross from a nearby branch and planting it gently in the snow beside her. "You were brave," he whispered. "Your babies will live because of you." Then they turned homeward. The hike back was harder. The snow had thickened with midday flurries. Ethan's breath came harsh, his boots dragging. Ranger forged ahead, his coat dusted white, tail sweeping like a black flame in the snow. The puppy against Ethan's chest trembled once, then went still again. He prayed it was sleep, not silence. By the time the cabin came into view, the clouds had darkened again, promising another storm. Ethan burst through the door, setting the pup gently beside the other in the blanket. Ranger followed, shaking snow across the floor. Ethan stripped off his gloves and knelt, massaging the new arrival's paws, repeating the ritual of the night before, slow, steady, unwilling to give up. Ranger lay beside the two pups, licking the frost from their fur. The older one stirred first, pressing its nose against the newcomer, a faint sound escaping both. Ethan felt his throat close. "They know each other," he said softly. "They must be siblings." Minutes passed, then a faint breath. The new pup's body twitched, its chest rising ever so slightly. Ethan exhaled, long and shaky, and pressed a palm to his eyes. "Thank you," he murmured, not sure whether he was speaking to God, the mother dog, or Ranger. The light outside dimmed again, snow falling in lazy spirals. Inside, the cabin was filled with quiet warmth, the kind that seeps deeper than fire. Ranger settled down, his large frame curving protectively around the two puppies. Ethan sat back, the weight of grief and gratitude mixing in his chest until he couldn't tell them apart. He looked at the pups, then at the wooden cross hanging by the window. "Maybe," he said quietly, "some love doesn't end. It just passes hands." Ranger lifted his head, eyes glowing in the firelight. Outside, wind began to hum again through the pines, but inside, life continued its fragile rhythm, proof that even in death's cold shadow, devotion still found a way to breathe. By the next afternoon, the sky above Farridge Valley turned the color of pewter, heavy and restless. Snow fell again, not the calm, drifting kind, but sharp, driven flakes that sliced sideways through the air like shards of glass. From the cabin window, Ethan Ward watched the storm gather with a familiar knot in his stomach. He had learned to read the signs, the way the light dimmed too quickly, the way the tree line blurred before the wind truly rose. Another blizzard was on its way. Inside, the fire burned bright, its glow spilling across the small room in a dance of orange and gold. Two tiny forms lay curled beside Ranger, the great shepherd who kept vigil as though guarding the gates of some fragile kingdom. The elder pup, with her pale silver coat, slept soundly now, stronger with each breath. The younger one, the one they had found beneath the fallen pine, was still weak but alive, her chest rising in faint, stubborn rhythm. Ethan had begun calling them the sisters, though he knew one might yet fade. He knelt by the fire, checking the pup's warmth, then ruffled Ranger's fur. "You've done more good than most men I know," he said quietly. The shepherd's tail thumped once, slow and steady, but his gaze remained fixed on the window, where snow danced like restless ghosts. The storm outside intensified. The cabin walls creaked as wind pressed against them. Ethan went to secure the shutters, his breath visible in the chill. "If this keeps up," he muttered, "we're trapped for days." He had enough wood and food, but he worried about the roof, old from years of Montana winters. Yet more than that, he worried about the life inside the cabin. 3 fragile creatures who trusted him to keep them safe. As evening fell, the storm arrived in full force. The sound was deafening, the roar of wind through the pines, the staccato of hail against the window panes. The lights flickered, the fire guttered low, and for a moment, the room dimmed to shadows. Ethan grabbed his coat and threw another log onto the flames, coaxing the fire back to life. "Stay with me," he murmured, to the fire, to the pups, to the house itself. Ranger, restless now, rose and began pacing. He went to the door, barked once, then again, sharper. Ethan turned. "No, not now. You're not going out in that." But Ranger kept barking, ears up, body tense. It wasn't impatience, it was alarm. Ethan's stomach dropped. "What is it, boy?" The wind howled in answer. He hesitated, glancing at the pups, then back to the dog. Ranger stood rigid, nose toward the door, every muscle alive with instinct. Something was wrong outside. Ethan could feel it too, that old pull from his days in search and rescue, that sixth sense that told him life was teetering somewhere close. He pulled on his boots, tightened his coat, and slung a rope across his shoulder. "All right," he said grimly. "Lead the way, but we make it quick." The moment he opened the door, the world roared in, a white wall of fury that swallowed sound and sight alike. Snow lashed his face, and the cold bit through his gloves like teeth. Ranger bounded into the storm, a blur of motion against the whiteout. Ethan followed, clutching his flashlight close to his chest, the beam cutting only a few feet ahead. They moved through the storm like figures in a dream. The ground had vanished under a thick, shifting carpet of snow. Branches whipped overhead, and the air howled with a pitch that could drive a man mad if he listened too long. Ethan's breath came in bursts, each one snatched away by the wind. Still, he pressed on, because Ranger pressed on. Then, faint through the chaos, a sound, a weak, broken whimper. Not Ranger, higher pitched, desperate. Ethan's pulse leapt. He angled his flashlight toward the sound, catching a flicker of motion, a small, dark shape half buried near a fallen log. He stumbled forward, dropped to his knees, and brushed the snow away. It was another puppy, smaller than the others, its fur nearly black, its eyes sealed shut with ice. Ethan's hands trembled as he scooped it up, pressing it against his chest. "You've got to be kidding me," he breathed. There were 3. Ranger barked once, circling close, his fur whipping in the wind. Ethan met his gaze. "Let's get home." The journey back was a battle. The snow blinded him, the ground vanished beneath shifting drifts, and once, his foot plunged into a hidden hole. He caught himself with one hand, clutching the pup tight with the other. "I've got you," he whispered hoarsely. "Hang on." Ranger turned back, teeth bared against the wind, and grabbed Ethan's sleeve, tugging hard until he regained balance. They trudged onward, man and dog, tethered by trust. By the time they reached the cabin, Ethan's body was numb, his face raw from the cold. He slammed the door shut, collapsed against it, and gasped for air. The cabin seemed impossibly warm now, the firelight blinding after the storm's darkness. Ranger shook himself, scattering snow across the floor, and hurried to the hearth. Ethan followed, lowering the new pup beside its sisters. The silver one stirred first, sniffing curiously at the tiny newcomer. The middle pup, the weaker one, gave a faint whimper. Together, they pressed closer, a small tangle of life, their bodies overlapping for warmth. Ethan leaned back on his heels, breath unsteady. 3, he whispered. All 3. He worked quickly, rubbing the smallest pup dry, feeding it tiny drops of milk from a cloth. It didn't respond at first, and he feared the worst. But then, like before, a shiver, a twitch, a sound no louder than a sigh. Ranger nudged Ethan's shoulder with his nose, tail wagging once. "Yeah," Ethan said, voice breaking with relief. "Yeah, she's alive." The storm outside raged for hours, but inside the cabin, another kind of battle played out. Quieter, tenderer. Ethan fed, warmed, and checked each pup in turn, his movements slow but sure. Ranger never left his side. When Ethan finally sank onto the floor beside the fire, the 3 pups were asleep, curled together in a soft heap of fur and breath. He studied them for a long moment, his mind drifting to the mother buried under snow. "You did your part," he whispered, "and somehow, through all this madness, they're still here." Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee, his eyes heavy but content. The fire cracked softly. The storm began to fade, its voice dulling to a whisper beyond the window. Ethan closed his eyes, exhaustion washing through him, and thought of something Sarah used to say when they returned from a rescue. "We don't save them all, Ethan, but sometimes the ones we do, that's enough to keep the light on." He looked again at the 3 sleeping pups, the glow of the fire wrapping them in gold. "The light's still on, Sarah," he murmured. "You'd be proud of him, of us." Outside, the wind sighed its last breath, and the snow settled over the valley like a soft white shroud. Inside, the cabin was warm with quiet victory. Ranger lifted his head, eyes catching the firelight one final time before closing. Beside him, the 3 pups slept in perfect peace. And in that stillness, Ethan felt something bloom deep within him, a fragile, impossible joy born from the heart of winter itself. When the world finally thawed, it did so slowly, like a deep breath after a long cry. Days passed before the snow eased its grip on Farage Valley, revealing dark soil and the first timid green shoots beneath. The river, once frozen silent, began to murmur again under the thawing ice. From his cabin window, Ethan Ward watched it all unfold, the quiet resurrection of the land, and felt a reflection of it in himself. Inside the cabin, the fire still burned, but now it was no longer for survival. It was warmth shared. 3 little pups slept in a heap near Ranger, their coats thickening, their bellies round from steady meals. The smallest one, dark as midnight, had become the loudest, always yipping first at mealtime. The silver one was calm and watchful, while the middle pup, soft gray and timid, followed Ranger everywhere, a shadow made of fur and faith. Ethan leaned in the doorway, sipping black coffee, and smiled. "Well, looks like we're running a daycare now," he said softly. Ranger wagged his tail, a sound of small claws tapping wood behind him as the pups stirred at the familiar voice. He had named them, at last, Hope, Grace, and Luna. Names that seemed to fit the way they breathed life back into the cabin. The names came to him one night while reading an old journal Sarah had kept, its pages filled with notes from their rescue missions. "Sometimes miracles don't shout," she'd written. "They arrive small, trembling, and wrapped in fur." Ethan set the mug down, picked up his camera, a battered old Nikon that had survived more storms than he had, and crouched near the hearth. "All right, hold still, you troublemakers," he murmured. Ranger lifted his head, posture proud. The 3 pups nestled between his paws. The firelight caught the gold in his eyes and the soft gleam of their fur. Ethan clicked the shutter once, twice, 3 times. The photograph came out perfect, raw and luminous. Ranger's calm strength, the pups' innocent tangle of warmth, the fire's quiet glow behind them. Something in it captured more than an image. It was proof of endurance, of kindness, of the simple holiness of care. Later that evening, as snow melted in soft drips from the eaves, Ethan uploaded the photo to his old community page. The caption was short, typed slowly, 1 breath at a time. "Last night my partner Ranger brought 3 tiny lives home from the snow. Against all odds they made it. Today they're sleeping by the fire, proof that even in the coldest places, grace still finds a way." He thought little of it. He wasn't chasing attention. But by morning, the post had begun to spread. First it reached the Farage Town Board, neighbors, hikers, the folks from the rescue division who still remembered him. Then it jumped farther. A wildlife rescue group shared it, then a Montana news station. By the end of the week, the story had crossed states. Rescue dog saves puppies from blizzard, the headlines read. Ethan didn't even know until the phone started ringing off the hook. He ignored most calls, but one message made him pause. It was from Carla Jennings, a volunteer at the local shelter. Her voice trembled with emotion. Mr. Ward, people have been calling all day asking how they can help. We've had donations pouring in, blankets, food, supplies. You and Ranger did something beautiful. He sat for a long moment after the message ended, staring at the pups tumbling over one another near Ranger's tail. We didn't mean to do anything, he said under his breath. But that was the truth of miracles. They rarely meant to happen. Over the following days, Farage became a quiet hub of kindness. Children drew pictures of Ranger and the pups, their crayon skies filled with sun and snowflakes. A retired carpenter stopped by with a hand-carved sign reading Ranger's Hearth and left it by the porch. Someone from the newspaper arrived, camera in hand, and Ethan, awkward in front of lenses, agreed only if Ranger got the spotlight. When the article went online, the comments came by the thousands. This restored my faith in humanity. Ranger is the hero we all needed. God bless the man who opened his door. Ethan read a few before closing the laptop, overwhelmed. They make it sound like we did something grand, he said. All we did was open a door. Ranger, stretched across the rug, blinked at him with calm wisdom. But late that night, as the fire sank to embers, Ethan found himself scrolling through those words again. The stories beneath them, people writing about loss, about hope, about the small things that had kept them going. It hit him then that maybe the miracle wasn't just 3 rescued pups. It was what they awakened. The reminder that compassion still mattered in a weary world. A knock came at the door one morning, a rare thing in such a remote place. On the porch stood Tom Reyes, a local mailman who often doubled as the valley's unofficial messenger. His cheeks were red from cold, but his grin was wide. "You're famous, Ward," he said, handing over a stack of envelopes. "Got letters from everywhere, Texas, Maine, even one from Ireland." Ethan laughed, shaking his head. "All this for 3 little dogs." 3.5, Tom said, tipping his cap toward Ranger. "That big fella's half angel from what I hear." When Tom left, Ethan sat at the table and opened the letters one by one. Most were simple. Thank you notes, prayers, a few drawings of dogs in snow. One, from a child named Hannah, read, "When I get sad, I look at Ranger's picture and remember that good things can come from storms." He read that line twice, then placed it on the mantel. Ranger patted over, resting his head on Ethan's knee. "You hear that, boy?" he murmured. "You got fans now." That evening, he took another picture. This time, all 4 of them. Ethan, Ranger, and the pups, under the porch light, as snow drifted down soft as feathers. He sent it to the shelter with a note. "Tell them miracles are contagious." By week's end, donations had funded a new kennel expansion at the Farage Animal Rescue. Carla called again, laughing through tears. "They're naming the new wing after you and Ranger," she said. "You've started something, Ethan. Something good." He didn't know what to say. He only looked down at the 3 little lives sleeping in a tangle of blankets. Ranger's paw lay gently over them and felt the smallest ache in his chest, a tender, grateful one. "Guess we didn't just save them," he whispered. "They saved us too." The fire crackled, the river sang faintly outside, and the stars, those old witnesses of every human prayer, burned clear over Farage. Somewhere far beyond the valley, people still shared the picture, still typed their amens beneath it. And in that humble cabin on the edge of the world, the man who once lived only with silence found himself part of something vast, bright, and beautifully human. By March, Farage Valley had shed its armor of ice. The snow that once buried fences now melted into rivulets that ran like silver threads through dark soil. Pines whispered again, no longer bowed beneath weight, but swaying gently in thawed air. Morning light streamed across the cabin's porch, glinting off the kettle Ethan had left outside to cool. It was the kind of light that belonged to beginnings. Inside, Ethan Ward sat at the old wooden table, writing in the margins of a worn notebook. His handwriting, once rigid and clipped, had softened, looping slightly at the ends of words. On the first page, he'd written a date, March 12th. Beneath it, a line that read, "The snow is finally giving back what it took." He set the pen aside and looked out the window. Beyond the frosted glass, Ranger bounded across the yard, with the three pups tumbling after him in a blur of fur and laughter. Hope, the silver one, ran with Grace, her movements confident and sure. Grace, the shy gray sister, stayed close to Ranger's heels, occasionally tripping over her own paws. Luna, the smallest and boldest, darted ahead to pounce on sticks twice her size, yapping with triumph every time Ranger pretended to lose the tug of war. Ethan leaned back, smiling. There was a time, not long ago, when this cabin had been a monument to silence. Now, the air vibrated with life. Paw steps, laughter, and the low thump of Ranger's tail had become its new rhythm. The fire still burned in the hearth, but the windows were open, letting in the smell of pine sap and thawed earth. Ethan rose, took his coffee, and stepped out onto the porch. The sunlight hit his face, soft but steady, warming the scars time had left untouched. He watched the dogs for a while, then his gaze drifted toward the edge of the forest, the place where Ranger had first found the dying puppy, where this quiet miracle had begun. The memory was sharper now than the cold ever was, the white roar of snow, the fear, the trembling hope cupped between his hands, and the warmth that followed, something bigger than gratitude, something that felt like grace. That afternoon, he took a wooden plaque he'd carved over the past few nights, a simple piece of cedar, smoothed and varnished, with words etched by hand, "For the mother who never gave up." He packed it carefully into his bag, called Ranger, and together they set out into the woods. The pups, curious, followed close behind, slipping and tumbling through the damp snow. The forest greeted them with soft light and the scent of wet bark. The snow had retreated into the shadows, leaving patches of earth where green had already begun to stir. The walk was quiet, save for the rustle of paws and the faint creak of melting ice. When they reached the fallen pine, Ethan stopped. The hollow beneath it, the place where he had found the frozen mother, was half filled with moss now, softened by time and spring's gentle hand. He knelt, setting the plaque into the ground. "You did well," he said quietly. "They made it." Ranger sat beside him, head bowed, eyes calm and knowing. The pups sniffed around the mound, tails wagging, unaware of the sacredness beneath their paws. Ethan brushed a hand over the plaque, then stood, his breath carrying a small prayer into the wind. "Maybe that's how he works," he murmured, "not by stopping the storm, but by giving us someone to walk through it with." The breeze lifted through the pines, and for a moment, the forest seemed to breathe with them. They lingered until the sun began to dip, casting long shadows that turned the snow gold. Ranger barked softly and the pups answered, chasing each other in dizzy circles until even Ethan laughed aloud, a sound that felt like spring itself. When they returned to the cabin, the valley was bathed in the rose light of evening. Ethan made a small fire outside, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals. The dogs settled around him, Ranger stretched out while the pups piled against his side. The air carried the scent of burning pine and damp grass, the smell of life returning. Ethan took another photo, this time not for the world to see, but for himself. Ranger in the fading light, eyes half closed, surrounded by the pups who had inherited both his courage and their mother's will. The photo caught something words never could, the quiet peace of redemption. Inside, he pinned the new photo beside the first one, the snowy scene from months ago. 2 worlds, 1 story. Beneath them, he placed Hannah's letter, the one written in a child's careful scrawl, "Good things can come from storms." As night fell, Ethan sat by the window, the golden light flickering across his face. Ranger dozed at his feet, one paw resting protectively across the smallest pup. Outside, the wind had softened to a whisper. The valley slept in peace. He raised his mug toward the stars. "Thank you," he said simply. To the night, to the unseen hand that had guided them through it all. For second chances. From somewhere deep in the forest came the distant cry of an owl. The world, for the first time in a long while, felt whole, and as the firelight glowed against the glass, Ethan realized that Farrage's long winter had never truly been about survival. It had been about transformation, about finding light in the cold, faith in loss, and love that refused to die. Outside, dawn waited just beyond the horizon, and when it came, it would rise over Farrage not as a stranger, but as a promise that even the coldest hearts can thaw when touched by warmth, and that some stories, like spring itself, are written to begin again. Sometimes God does not calm the storm. Instead, He places someone, or something, beside us to walk through it. Just as Ethan found hope again through Ranger and the lives he saved, we too can find the hand of God working quietly in the ordinary moments of our days. Every act of kindness, every spark of compassion, is a living miracle. When we care for one another, when we forgive, when we choose love over fear, that is where His light shines the brightest. So, if this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs a reminder that miracles are still real. Leave a comment to tell us how it moved you, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of faith and hope. May God bless you and your loved ones, and may His grace guide you through every storm you face. If you believe in the power of His miracles, type Amen in the comments below.